Good morning, everyone. Welcome to T4 Gateway, Part B, Session 1. My name is Cliff Bowles. I'm going to run these three sessions. Normally, when we run these sessions for CIMA, we ask people to give us questions. I didn't receive any questions for T4, so I've had to determine what we might do this first session. But I'm open to suggestions as we work through it. You may have some things that you want me to cover, and I'm happy to do it. So what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to, in part one, I'm going to go through the exam outline. So we're all absolutely clear of what it is that that is expected of you when you do the exam. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on the post-exam guide for the September 2014 T4. There's a lot of information there that we can use to learn what to do and what not to do. I'm going to have a look at the pre-scene. You've already got the pre-scene, and presumably, hopefully, you've read it and already done some analysis. These are long documents, so I'm not going to go through line by line. I'm not going to read it to you. You could read just as well as anybody else. I'm going to try and point out some of the things that struck me if I were to sit this exam again. We'll have a little break, and in part two, we'll look at this thing that's available on the CIMA website, a pre-scene analysis by a CIMA tutor called Adrian Sims, which is quite useful. We then need to think about what we might do in the next two sessions, and I'm going to suggest something for sessions 2, but I'm open to suggestions from you as to what we might cover. The more you tell me about what difficulties you're having, the easier it is for me to prepare something and demonstrate it to you. So if you're happy with that, that's fine. If I hear some feedback from you, what I'll do is I'll mute you. You'll see the little red microphone appear, and that means I've muted you. And if you want to speak to me, there's a little hand symbol just below your names, and I'll just click it on to my name now and click it off. So if you want to stop me and speak to me, just raise your hand. I might ask you if you agree or disagree with something, and if you agree with me, you might want to give me a green tick, and if you disagree, I'm very happy if you disagree. I don't mind that. That's it. Vitus, thank you, and click it off. So that gives you some communication. If you lose sound or lose vision, there's a chat function below. You can send me a private message by just selecting my name, the host, or you can send it to all participants. But if you want to say something privately, send it privately. So that's the chat factor. Okay. Now, I've talked to a couple of you. Maybe you've done this exam before, so I've talked to Jan. What about you, Joe? Have you done this exam before? Joe, can you hear me? No?
I can hear you, no, I haven't.
You haven't? This is your
No, I haven't.
first time?
First time, yeah.
Fine. Okay. Okay, thank you. Pierre, what about you, Pierre? Yeah, it's not there. Okay, all right. So let's get started. If you've got any questions, then yell out. First thing we need to know, and I'm sure you know this already, but I've got to do it. I've got to go through and explain to you what this exam is all about. I'm sure you're aware of this, so I won't spend too much time on it. There's a pre-scene that you've seen about the EL car company, and this is going to be part of what you're going to be tested on. You're going to have a 3-hour exam, and you're going to have some reading time before that exam starts. I'm just going to mute everybody because I'm getting a bit of feedback. What it says here, it's an integrated exam that combines the 3 strategic level papers, E3, P3, and F3. Now, if you're not familiar with any of those E3, P3, or F3 subjects, or you've forgotten them, or you've not done them before, we're also running some webinars for those subjects, and CIMA are putting the recordings of those on the website, and you're also very welcome to join in. So if you've got some area of P3 that you want to be for example, if you want some help on that, join one of the other webinars or watch the recordings. So there's also some things that you might need from other operational or management levels, maybe some calculations, and we'll look at that as we go through. So what we're looking at here is principally looking at strategic management accounting. So what we're doing is we've got a case study and we're going to have to analyze it, we're going to have to make recommendations, and we're going to have to support those recommendations, often with calculations or theory. All right, and so what this exam is doing is integrating a variety of skills to arrive, as it says here, at a recommended solution. It doesn't mean that there's a single answer. The examiners are quick to point out often there's more than one answer, and it isn't trying to get the right answer. It's trying to recognize the problem and make some sensible suggestions which are backed up with evidence, as we'll see shortly. So the emphasis is on assessing your capabilities and your competence in applying knowledge and demonstrating skills of analysis, of evaluation and presentation, and especially in part B, of communication. So that's what the exam's all about. And we're going to discuss each of those things in a bit more detail. These aims, I won't read them all, but you can certainly get these from the T4 Gateway information from CIMA. What we're looking for, or what CIMA is looking for, is technical knowledge. So you can apply it in an analytical manner, solving problems, complex problems. This particular case study, the L car company, is like most big manufacturing entities, a complex series of problems. What you are going to be asked to do is to solve particular problems given some data. And the real data that you will be given you won't see until the day of the exam. So this is the pre-scene, and then you'll have some more information given to you at the exam. So what you're going to be asked to do is identify the problems. You're going to be asked to prioritize them, and you need to explain why you've put the priority in that particular order. You're going to have to demonstrate maybe alternative solutions, and you're going to integrate different areas of knowledge and skills. And next week we'll have a look at some of those theoretical areas. What they're the CIMA examiners or the CIMA board are particularly interested is also your ability to communicate, particularly with non-financial users. And so that communication in a logical fashion is important. And in every T4 exam, there's a requirement to identify and advise on ethical issues or ethical dilemmas. And you'll see that the examiners point to a lot of errors in this area where people confuse ethical decisions or ethical dilemmas with business dilemmas, and we need to be clear about that. There's a possible 100 marks, and as you're probably aware, you need to score 50 marks or more to pass, so it's not that onerous. The marks are available in these areas, and we're going to go through in the post-exam guide each of these areas one at a time to try and understand from previous exams what went well and what went badly. In particular, you've got to look at these big numbers: application, judgment, and logic. And of course, in this logic area, there's 30 marks, which looks like it's the most important. This is actually broken down into 20 marks for the logic of part A and 10 marks for part B, which is usually some form of communication. So you need to be aware of how you're going to get your 50 plus marks and in which areas are going to present the low-hanging fruit or the easiest ones for you to do. next week, I'll come back to that later on. So next week, I'll come back to that. So what I want to do now is to start. Let me just, before I start on the PEG, let me just unmute you all and ask if anybody's got any questions about just the exam in itself. Anybody, if you're okay with it, can you give me a tick if you're okay with what I've just talked about? Give me a tick like that, just so I know you're there and still alive. Yep, thanks, okay. Yep. Okay, good. All right, thank you. So what I'm going to do now, because I think of the documents that you could be looking at, one of the most important is this thing called the post-examination guide. So can you all unclick your green ticks for a moment? Can you unclick your green ticks, please? Thank you. Carl, can you unclick? Now, how many of you have looked at this September 2014 post-exam guide seriously? If you have, give me a tick. If you haven't, and be honest with yourself, give me a cross. Okay, so we've got 2 ticks, 2 crosses, and 3 ticks. Okay. All right, thank you. All right, I think this is very important. This is why I started with it. So I'm just gonna mute you all again. So just bear with me a sec. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this. I'm not going to read it all to you. You're all intelligent people. You understand this. I'm going to highlight some of the things for me, if I were interested in taking this exam, some of the things that I think are important. That doesn't mean that they're the only important things, but they're the things that are important when I read it. Okay, so the idea of this post-exam guide is to give some feedback to people in September who took the exam, but also to provide guidance to you, prospective candidates, for the November 2014 exam, which is coming up. So what it's talking about here is going to give you, for each of those assessment areas, a comment on what happened. It's going to give you a statement of common errors and omissions and things that you might have done well or badly. So, I mean, you've read the pre-scene. I don't need to go through that. We'll have a look at the pre-scene in a moment, so I'm not going to do this. What's going to happen, though, when you turn up to the exam, you're going to get something called the unseen material. So the pre-scene, you can read now, you can play around with it. When you go to the exam, you can't take your notes with you. You've got to get a fresh pre-scene. And in addition to that, you'll get 4 or 5 or 6, I don't know how many pages, but what's called an unseen material. And most of the meat of the exam, of course, will be in this unseen material, because this is going to give you the things that you're going to have to answer. So what usually happens is that there's going to be 2 parts to the exam. Part A is to write a report, and write a report about some issues. Now, some of the issues you might see in the pre-scene, and there are certainly a lot of them. But when you look at the September 2014 exam, you'll see that the unseen material introduced quite a number of new things, which is what you'd expect. And what you've got to do is to prepare a report, usually to the board or to the CFO or somebody like that, that prioritizes, analyzes, and evaluates the issues facing EL based on the unseen and the pre-scene material. And you've got to make some recommendations. That's the usual way that you're doing it. Part B is often a communication, like an email, might be a short report. And the idea of this is they're going to look at your communication skills. How do you write an email to a finance director? How do you phrase it? How do you couch it? Can you follow instructions? Can you make sure it doesn't exceed 10 short sentences? Can you stick to the point? And so on. So the first one is analysis. The second one is communication, and very important. As it says, we've just looked at these 9 criteria, 90 marks for the report and 10 marks for Part B. So 10 marks is worth going for. And the analysis should include, and we'll talk about this more, financial and numerical calculations, particularly those which come from the unseen exam material. Now, you want to become management accountants. Obviously, one of the things that they're going to expect you to demonstrate is that you are able to do calculations. Sorry, I'm just reading a message from Dan. Do I know if the final exam in 2000 will be similar? I don't know, Dan. Dan's asked me if I know the final exam will be similar. It'll be similar in structure. I'm sure that you'll have to do A and B like this, but what A and B will contain, I don't know, and I shouldn't know. I would think you've got to expect to write a report to somebody, some senior management. You may not have to write an email, you might write a report, but they're certainly going to test your written communication skills in some way. So it's a question of saying, well, okay, I'm going to have to do this. How can I prepare for it? And we'll go through this PEG and we'll have a look at what you might do to prepare. So in September 2014, there was introduced, in addition to the pre-seen material about the L car company, some things which you will expect to have in November, except there'll be different things, and I don't know what they are. But in September, what was introduced was a revenue and profit increasing plan, 10 by 10. And what was also introduced was the idea of some decentralization, because they had a recall of 450,000 vehicles, and the root cause of this problem appeared to be the management style, the centralized management style that they inherited. The third priority, industrial relations. Fourth priority, competitor analysis. Now, you're not given these priorities. You're not even told that these are the issues. What you need to deal with is which of these are more important. So the examination guide is actually giving you, in a model answer, what those priorities were. You should expect something quite different, of course, in the unseen material. And we might make some guesses at it, but we could be completely wrong. So the idea is to be as flexible and as open as you can, and just absorb what's in the pre-seen material and be prepared. And we might look at some of the things that could appear, because there are some clues when we look at this examination report. There were also, as there will be in November, I'm sure, 2 ethical issues. Now, they're not called ethical issues when in the unseen material. You have to determine, of the unseen material and the relationship with the pre-seen material, what are ethical issues. And in this case, there were 2 ethical issues, one to do with industrial relations and working conditions. That seemed to be a big problem in L car company. And the second one was the braking system. And we'll come back and look at this. So generally speaking, the format of the candidate's answers was good. And what I'm going to do later is show you a standardized format that you might want to think about using for this particular type of response. The suggested format is you make some, you suggest some priorities, you talk about some problems, you evaluate them, you make some recommendations, you justify your recommendation, and you recommend some action to be taken. And one of the things they're talking about here is not just repeating yourself, not just saying, here's the same thing over and again. It's easy just to fill up lots of pages to talk about just repeating it. But if you've already stated it in the discussion, just leave it there. Very big thing here is to consider alternative approaches to resolving any particular issue. So when you're looking at an issue, for example, any of these issues that you might have identified, let's see this revenue and profit plan, 10 by 10. Don't just look at one issue. What the examiners are saying is consider alternative approaches, okay, and then select the approach you want to recommend, justifying why it's been selected, and then explaining how you're going to implement this. So we'll come back to that. So low marks for repeating what's been said. You can put these calculations or a conclusion. You can have, I think you'll be able to use Excel or Word, and you can put Part B as a word. Some candidates fail to address Part B. Some people didn't do that. It's worth 10 marks. If you don't do it, you're obviously not going to get anything. This link here that is on this PEG doesn't work. So I couldn't find on the CIMA website this thing that they're talking about. But that's okay. We'll deal with that in another way. So here's a repeat of what we've seen earlier, the assessment criteria. And what we're going to do now, I'll just go back up here a little bit. What we're going to do now is go through each of these criteria, technical application, blah, 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 with the examiner to try and learn from them. So the purpose of technical, and we've seen that technical is not a high mark thing, but the purpose is to assess the use of relevant theoretical techniques. And what we're going to do next week is have a look at some of these theoretical techniques, like a Swot analysis, like ANSOF, etc., etc. So we might look at those in more detail and refresh your memory if you're not familiar with them. So it's better to, what they're saying is, if you're going to use a technical knowledge like a Swot, include it in the report, okay, and apply it. This is the most important thing. Apply it to the subject matter. Don't leave it to just theory, okay? So what we're going to do next week, what the examiners suggest that you need to know about are some of these theoretical ideas. SWOT analysis, I'm sure you're familiar with that, but next week we'll have a look at the SWOT analysis. This thing called suitability, acceptability, and feasibility. I'll go through that next week if you wish me to. Mendelow's stakeholder matrix, ANSOF's growth vector, and Porter's 5 forces and Porter's diamond. These seem to be the major theoretical things to deal with the strategy for this particular thing. Sorry, I've got a message here from Carl. I'm taking the exam in Christchurch. Do you know if it will be paper-based or computer-based? Sorry, Carl, I don't. You'll need to just check with CIMA. I'll give you, if you don't know who to contact in CIMA, I'll give you my email address. You email me and I'll put you in touch with the right person. So what they're saying in this thing is it's better to use technical knowledge as an illustration. They don't want to have a theory. A SWOT is this, a SWOT is that, ANSOF is this. They don't want to hear any of that. The only thing that they'll want to see is if you're going to use any of these technical knowledges, how do you apply it to this particular case? Otherwise, just forget about it, because you're not going to get any marks just for saying, I know what Porter's 5 forces are. If you're going to use Porter's 5 forces, how does it relate to the L car company? And in particular, how does it relate to the unseen material? The examiner says it is always appropriate to produce a SWOT. I absolutely agree. If you're not familiar with SWOT, please work on it. In fact, what I would do if I was preparing for this exam, I would do a SWOT analysis of the pre-seen material. However, you must understand that this could change with the unseen material, but it's good practice because to me, the SWOT analysis is going to give you the threats, the opportunities, the weaknesses, etc. So very clearly, the examiner is saying, produce a SWOT analysis. I wholeheartedly agree. Again, repeating. Don't just name drop. Don't just write in ANSOF's whatever. It's not going to get you any marks. if you can't relate it to the case study, don't bother. It just wastes time and puts the examiner off. There are occasionally some candidates who don't produce a SWOT. Well, if you don't produce a SWOT, I don't think you're going to pass this exam. You need to produce a SWOT. It's very important. You must make sure all 4 quadrants of the SWOT are analyzed or completed. So there's got to be something in all 4 quadrants. It doesn't have to be a long list. It doesn't have to be an extensive SWOT. It just has to be the main things. What are the main strengths? What are the main weaknesses? What are the main opportunities? What are the main threats? So what I would suggest you do, and I'll do it myself by next week if you want to come next week, and even if you want to send me, I'll give you my email address. If you want to send me your SWOTs, I'll give you some feedback. Because having a good SWOT is important. So what I suggest you do is do a SWOT of the pre-scene, and that helps your thinking. Because if you look at the SWOT, it's going to help you assemble the issues, and then you can, from that, get the priority. So, very important. The next section is called application. And this is all about how well do you use these techniques to support your analysis. And the key phrase for me in the examiner's remarks, okay, sorry, I've got chat here. Vitus Ferrandis, can I use a separate booklet for appendices in the exam? I would think you'd need to do it in the same, I would use an appendix in the same document, Vitus. However, I will, I'm not an examiner for CIMA, so I'm not sure what rules they might have in different branches. So I'll take your questions here, and I'll check with CIMA, and I'll come back to you on those. The key phrase here is only use these models, these frameworks that we've talked about, SWOT, ANSOF, Merkalow, only use it in such a way it provides information which is relevant to the case. It's so important. You must link the use of one of these techniques to the case. This also applies in respect of calculations. When you're doing calculations, it's got to be relevant to the information. And so it's again repeated here. Marks are available for applying these techniques, but only if they apply them to the specific case. So, important. So now let's repeat this, because again, this is important. So what they're talking about here is providing a SWOT analysis. Candidates are reminded it's mainly the unseen material on which they should base their answers, and should ensure all the prioritized issues are included in the SWOT. Okay. So what they're talking about is developing stuff that you see in the pre-scene and develop it with the unseen material. That's the idea. Okay. So what you've got to do is maybe do a SWOT now on the pre-scene, but you've got to be prepared to update your preconceptions in the light of the unseen material. So it doesn't have to be a major thing. Just think about it and think, okay, how will my SWOT change with this unseen material? So what they're going to give you in the unseen material are some issues. In this case, 10 revenue and 10 plus 10% revenue, 10% profit. Is it an opportunity or a threat? Okay. So you've got to be clear about where you're putting these things, and you need to work that. I do a lot of teaching for CPA students, and I do a lot of Excel work with them. And this is something I see a lot. Common area, if you're using spreadsheets, if you're using Excel, have a think about what you're doing here. I mean, if you're dealing with a business like an L car company with, I don't know, $20 billion worth of revenue, why are you doing Excels with decimal points and dollars and cents? deal with millions of dollars, deal with thousands of dollars. Millions of dollars is probably good enough. Most of their annual reports will be in millions of dollars. So don't do them in huge numbers. It's crazy. So work your spreadsheets in an appropriate way. Some candidates put so many zeros in, and then they can't interpret what the numbers should be. Abbreviate your numbers. Very important. If you work in a big company like that, you're not talking about $50. You're talking about $50 million. Okay. Also, common sense tells you here that you need to look at your answers. In this case, the examiner's saying some had operating profits higher than gross margins. Just common sense. Common sense says, I just need to read this. Okay. And if you've done that, obviously you're going to make incorrect conclusions. And you can read this. You can read this yourself. But usually there's a little what we call mousetraps in the teaching business. There's usually some little word that's going to get you confused. In this case, they had some increases in the direct cost of sales per car. And you've got to watch these little words here: per unit, per month, per week. Because that's usually a trap for the unwary, and often people forget to convert it to something else. In this case, it was only the cost of the car, wasn't all of the production costs. And some people just didn't read those little words. So watch out for those. Per. Whenever you see that word per, highlight it. Make sure you understand the second word. So there's some failures here. You can read these yourself. I don't need to go through these for you. One of the things they had here was an issue where they had to fix some air conditioning and they had to stop the production. There seems to be quite a bit of confusion here about working the payback or savings. Now, obviously, if you have to stop production and spend some money on fixing something like this air conditioning, obviously you're going to lose production. What's the opportunity cost of lost production, as well as the cost of the investment? Okay, I'm going to repeat these things. You might think I'm being boring, but it's very important to listen to what the examiner is saying. Candidates must be prepared to systematically work through the information contained in the unseen case material and produce appropriate calculations. Okay. So what they're suggesting is that the fact that you've had this time to read the pre-seen material, you are really in a position like if you were a management accountant of this car company. You already got some information. You've had time to do some research, which hopefully you will do. So you should be well prepared to do some calculations. But as it says here, and this is always the case, read the information carefully. I don't know how many times I've marked papers of different exams. I don't mark this exam, by the way, which is why I can teach it. But I mark exams where my response is a wonderful answer, but to a completely different question. So what is the information that you've got, and what is it you're trying to deal with? It's very common. Candidates must be ready to prepare accurate calculations. Okay. Many of the errors were careless. This is the last exam for you to become a professional accountant. It's expected that you will be able to do calculations which are accurate. Okay. And so what they're talking about here, carelessness is important. They acknowledge that you're under a time limit. That's fine. You've got 3 hours. But careless errors are not really acceptable. Careless errors, I mean, if you were, if I've done lots of reports to boards of directors in my working life. If I sent to a board of directors some information that was completely inaccurate, I wouldn't have my job very long. So, you need to be thorough in what you're looking at. Diversity is the next one. Diversity means able to apply something to real life situations. Okay, real life situations. Recognition of issues irrespective of whether or not they occur in the same industry. So this is about experience, if you like. How do you bring in relevant examples? How do you bring in something that is appropriate to deal with this? Okay, so you need to bring in examples. When we come to the Adrian Sims analysis of the pre-seen material, he's talking about looking at some particular websites, which I'll suggest that you do, because the car industry has lots of information out there about the car industry. 2 or 3 of these websites that he recommends have a store of information which would give you some background of something or some examples. So candidates should seek to bring in relevant examples. And what they're talking about here is giving marks for each relevant example. So you get a mark for one example. If you repeat the same example in different formats, you won't get any marks. So discussion of real life companies in the introduction won't attract more than 1 mark. So you've got to have a relevant example for each issue. And you need to explain why the example is relevant. Okay? So try and give some examples, and I'll point you in a direction of where you might get some relevant examples shortly. Focus. This is talking about which are the most important issues. There's no right answer here, but some issues obviously might seem much more important than others, and it depends how you argue them. It's for you to determine what the most relevant issues are. Okay, it's up to you. If an issue is prioritized and then not discussed with the report, you won't get a mark for identifying that issue. So if you identify an issue in your priority, here's the top 5 things that we need to deal with. You need to make sure you deal with those 5 when you look at the analysis section. So that's prioritization. Priorities should be simply prioritized first, second, third. A, B, or C is probably not really enough because they're just sequential. What we're suggesting here is that priorities are, this is number 1 priority, this is number 2 priority, okay? And each should be justified with a concise explanation, just a short explanation. Why has it been ranked first? Why is this the most important priority? Markers do award marks if they're different from the marking guide. An examiner has a marking guide. This is what we expect. But you can get marks even if they're not in the marking guide or in the priority in the marking guide if you make a persuasive case, if you argue it properly. Okay. Well, again, they're repeating here. The SWOT analysis, if carefully carried out, should help to clarify which are the most important issues to be addressed. So, okay, so we're getting on to the important one, the judgment. What this means is the exercise of commercial and professional judgment in discussing these issues. What's the purpose of undertaking an analysis? Well, the findings can support. These are evidence. What we're looking for here is evidence so that you can discuss these issues. All right, so we're going to have a look at a model, a SWOT, Ansof's growth, Porter's diamond, or whatever it is. We're going to do some financial calculations maybe. Now we've got some evidence of which we might talk about or discuss these issues. Again, the examiner is saying you are going to get marks for providing alternative approaches. If you just say this is the way to fix this problem, you'll maybe get some marks. But if you say, well, there's a couple of options here, there's A and B, A will do this and B will do that, but I think A is probably better, that will be much better for you. What they're looking for here is an in-depth analysis, including the results of accurate numerical and financial analysis. So even though we might be talking about a strategic model like Porter's 5 Forces, you still, because you're a management accountant, you're doing an accounting exam, you're going to have to back it up with numerical and financial analysis. So that's really important. What they're saying here is make sure that in your time planning of your exam, and I'm sure you've done enough exams for me not to have to tell you how to manage your time, but it's essential that sufficient time and effort is put into carrying out this critical analysis. The alternatives need to be analyzed in depth, and you need to provide some evidence. So if you imagine somebody auditing a business, what they're looking for is evidence. This supports it. I think this forecast is wrong. This is the reason why. Here's my calculation. Here's why I think this forecast is wrong. You need to discuss the meaning of your financial analysis, and you need to consider a wider perspective. This is hard for people who aren't managing the business and doing it day to day. You develop that perspective as you're managing something, but you're sitting an exam, you've got 3 hours, you're under time pressure, and you're expected to have a wider perspective. But a wider perspective is probably going to help you, I think. Common errors, important one, discussing issues without preparing the relevant numerical financial calculations. So if you want to talk about improving cash flow, don't talk about improving cash flow without doing a cash flow analysis of some sort. It's not going to work. Okay. In this particular exam, I just highlighted some of these things here. I suggest you read this yourself, but I just highlighted some things. Concentrating on the executive director's comments and not discussing or focusing on your own financial analysis. Just because you're given something doesn't mean that it's right, it's done well, it's accurate. Everybody makes errors, and you need to trust your own judgment here. We've talked about this before, failing to compare the opportunity costs of ceasing production. So again, that's looking at the wider issues. Somebody says, what's the payback on this investment? Okay, I'm going to spend $100,000. It's going to take a year. Payback is, whatever. But what about the other things, the other costs that are involved? They may not be mentioned directly. You've just got to think a little bit wider and say, is there anything else here that I need to consider? So, competitor analysis. This is a favorite one. Failure to consider the types and sources of information in order to undertake a competitor analysis. We'll talk about that next week, competitor analysis. But there's no point in talking about a competitor analysis unless you can say, well, where are you going to get the data from? How do you know it's accurate? Again, I'm just repeating, it's important candidates concentrate on the issues in the actual case and on the unseen material. Time must be set aside. So you need to plan your time. In an exam, normally you can do it on the number of marks, 100 marks, 3 hours. Each mark is going to take 1.8 minutes. So if you've got 5 marks, you really should only be spending 5 times 1.8 minutes on that part. Something like that. You need to be clear and be disciplined. As you're probably aware, you've done lots of exams, so you should know that. There's no single right answer, so you're just as entitled to give your opinion about something as long as as long as you do the in-depth analysis, you do the financial analysis, and you support what you're saying with some sound evidence. Okay, there's no absolutely one option, as there never is in business. If you're in business, you know there's very rarely one option that you can take in a strategy or in any situation. There's usually lots of choices, and one of the skills of management is to be able to make choices. We need to talk about ethics, and one of the things that is clear in the pre-seen material is that there are no real ethical issues that I can see in the pre-seen material. So what's going to happen is you're going to get presented with those in the unseen. And what you've got to do is recognize what the ethical issue is. So first thing is recognize it, and then to explain what the ethical dilemma. It's usually a dilemma. If I do this, this will happen. If I do that, that will happen. The common problem is confusing ethical issues with business issues. All right. And down below, there's some examples here, and it's important that you're very clear about this. An ethical issue and a business issue. How do you separate them? How do you sort them out? For example, down here, reputation is not an ethical issue. So if something happens that causes your reputation of your business to be tarnished in any way, that in itself is not an ethical issue. It's a business issue. And so be careful when you're looking at these ethical issues. Ask yourself the question, am I sure this is an ethical issue, or would it be a business issue? So, for example, there was a problem with the braking system. The ethical issue was the duty of care. The duty of care to the customers. That was the ethical issue. The fact that it was going to cost X million dollars to fix it, that's the business issue. And you can't say the braking system failure is the ethical issue. The ethical issue is the duty of care to customers. So you've got to be very clear about that. And always there'll be at least 2 ethical issues in each unseen. So again, part of what your pre-reading is going to do is to go through the unseen material and see if you can highlight at least 2, there may be more, ethical issues, but be clear that they are ethical issues and not business issues. They could be related, like in September, there was a problem with the braking system. Now, the braking system itself is a business issue, but the consequences for the customer of advising them, of telling them, hey, you've got a problem here, that's the ethical part. So you need to understand that. So the recommendations, the logic. Can you make well-justified, commercially sound recommendations for each prioritized issue? Underline this word, commercially sensible and realistic. The recommendations you have to be commercially sensible, they have to be realistic, and they have to be based on supporting financial analysis. So you can't just say recommendations. There's some examples in a moment, which we'll look at, of very woolly recommendations. They have to be very precise, and a lot of people find that difficult. So here's what I was talking about here. Often candidates are vague in their advice and presented with no justification. So are these recommendations, do something about it, more controls are needed, the board should meet, the board should review? No. They're not. They're just so vague and woolly. They're not real recommendations. So it's got to have some action. So what's going to actually be the action that you're recommended? Do something about it is too vague. Monitor the plan closely. Too vague. What's it going to do? So we need, and when we come to Adrian Sim's examination of the pre-SEAM, we'll look at some examples of recommendations. And next week, we'll go through a model answer from a previous exam, and we'll also look at the type of recommendations that you need to make. So, the other thing that people don't really consider, but it's important to, again, if you're in business, it's just common sense. If you're going to make a recommendation, what sort of timescale are you talking about? What sort of time? Introduce something. Yeah, okay. In a week, a year, a month, 2 years, 10 years? Okay. A timescale always helps. It's very much more practical. We'll look at the suggested answer next week to look at how they should be presented. So it's a really important area, this. So errors when looking at recommendation, time management, not leaving enough time, so the recommendations are short, repeating what you've said before without actually doing something, poor or weak rationale, failure to provide recommendation on all the prioritized issues. So again, you've got to try and look at these priorities, maybe 4 or 5, and say, what do we recommend for each of them? And for each of them, you've got to have some numerical or financial analysis to support what you're saying. You are management accountants after all. And one more thing, if you're dealing with ethics, make sure the recommendations that you do are consistent with the things that you talk about in ethics. So if in the ethics area you say there's a problem with unions, for example, or duty of care or something, we think we should, do this always. In the recommendations for the business part of it, don't go against that because that's inconsistent. Okay, so, all right, how are we going for time? Oh, this is taking longer than I expected. Integration. Integration simply means that the report that you have is related, integrated. Parts of it relate to other parts. And what the CIMA examiner is looking for is going to award marks for reports which seem highly professional, sound, satisfactory, inadequate, or poor. So if you get highly professional, you're going to get 5 marks, sound, satisfactory, and so on. Here's a suggested how you might structure your reports, and I think this is something that I would practice with. I'd have a little model of this in Word or something like that. Table of contents, if you're using Word and you don't know how to do a table of contents, find out, learn. It's not easy, it's not difficult. Terms of reference and introduction, prioritization, analysis, ethical issues might be their recommendations and the appendices, which might include Part B. That's a typical way you might structure it. And I would, perhaps for me, I would decide how I'm going to structure it even before I go into the exam. I've got it clear in my mind how I'm going to structure it so you don't waste time trying to figure out how do I put all this together. Here's a template. It can be easily changed, but once you've got it, it's fine. It's important to effectively integrate the different parts of the report. So the recommendations have to deal with the issues. Okay? The issues have to deal with the introduction and so on. Low marks awarded if integration or analysis is not sufficient, if discussion was vague, okay, numerical analysis was weak, errors in calculation. Errors in calculation can make the whole thing different. If you think a particular analysis says that you're going to lose even more money and you recommend closing down something, obviously that can be quite a serious flaw in your presentation. Candidates should be prepared to present their recommendations with confidence. and support them with rational arguments. What they're expecting of you is that you are a management accountant with some experience and some confidence in your own ability and some confidence in your ability to look critically at the work that you're doing, your own work, to make sure that it has a quality, a standard. Ethics we've talked about there. Common error, the advice was vague. Any advice you give about ethics, of course, must be ethical. It's important to be consistent. The rationale. Okay, so this is part B. Now, part B is worth 10 marks, and I think it's important. The purpose of part B is to test your ability to communicate in a competent, professional way relating to a particular issue contained in the unseen material. So unfortunately, we can't do that. But you could practice. You could practice, for example, by taking a piece of information and practice. For example, in this case, writing an email to somebody. Let's say the financial director. In this case, in September, the candidate was asked to write an email to the financial director explaining the importance of accurately forecasting profit. The email should include reference to your analysis, the candidate's analysis of the 10+10 plan, and a conclusion of whether the plan was achievable or not. And obviously, it tells you the email should not exceed 10 short sentences. So if you write 12 long sentences, don't expect to get marks. Marks are awarded on the strength of the communication and whether it actually does what has been asked for and conveys the information in an appropriate manner. So how do you go about writing to somebody? You probably write a dozen emails a day to various people. Imagine that you're usually, in this case, you're usually going to have to write an email to a senior member of the company, maybe somebody you don't deal with personally. In an employment situation, LCARS, I think, has got 43,000 employees. The chances of a management accountant coming into contact with a finance director is very remote. So maybe you need to assume that it's somebody you don't know personally. So again, you've got to think about, how do I approach this? I don't suggest you start off the email, "G'day, mate, how you going?" You need to think about how you're going to address this person. So what are the errors in this communication? Failure to restrict the sentences to 10, that's cardinal. If they tell you it should be 10, don't make it 10, 11. Failure to provide short sentences. What's a short sentence? This is a short sentence. This is a short sentence. That's probably a long sentence. Maybe one line, short sentence. Failure to address all parts of the question. Down here, hi is not an appropriate greeting in a serious business email. I'm writing to the finance director. I'm one of 43,000 employees. I don't know this person. I don't think I'd say, "Hi, mate." How would you address the finance director? Let me unmute you all and see if you're all still awake. Address the finance director in an email. Hello?
Hello.
Yeah. Okay, Vitus, tell me, how would you address the financial director in an email? Sorry?
I would say sir.
Sir.
Dear.
In Australia, maybe.
In Australia, dear.
In Australia, maybe not. You know, it depends on the country. Yes, depends on. In some countries, you'd say sir, but we're in Australia now, so I probably wouldn't say sir. Carl, what do you think?
You say hi.
Hi? No.
Yes. No.
Don't say hi. You don't know this person. You don't know this person.
Okay.
That's the American way. Hi. But you don't. What do you think? Dan, what do you think?
Dear?
Dear? No. No. This is not a letter to your auntie. How are you going to start your email? It sounds a trivial thing, but this sets the tone for the whole email. Okay, I'm just going to have to enter mutual for a sec, so I'm getting a lot of feedback. Have a think about this. Now, some people from different countries have different ways of dealing with people in senior positions. And again, you've got to think, okay, in this case, this is L Car Company. Now, this is probably an Asian car company. Let's think of something like Hyundai. It's not Japanese because they talk about Japanese separately. So think about Hyundai or Kia or something like that. They're in Korea. It's a family business. The family owned 55% of the business. So how would you you might say, dear sir, but I don't think so. I don't think that's probably too formal. So I'd like you to think about this by position title. Okay, so Carl is saying, dear Mr. Okay, hold on a sec, see what else. Dear Mr. by position title. So what would you say? Financial director? Yeah, you might do that. To financial director. Or you might say to Mr. Smith, financial director. Okay, but think about it. Think about how you're going to start this conversation with somebody who is not somebody you know. You must make that assumption. In this case, you're a management accountant. You're working in Sydney, Australia. You're one of 43,000 people. You're addressing it to this person. Don't say hi. Think about it. Okay. All right. Let's think. So this is very important. This is the last thing about the examiner's things. CIMA. It should be understood. Employers. That's employers of people that want to employ CIMA graduates or CIMA accountants. They seek candidates who are not only competent in management accountancy, but are able to communicate effectively. This is the main reason why Part B exists in T4. Again, I teach a lot of CPA students. The key skill that you need is communication. You could do the best analysis, financial analysis, but unless you can communicate it to somebody in the right way, then it's hopeless. So it's really important that you are able to communicate what it is you're trying to say in the right way. And this is just an abbreviation in this Part B to ask you. Yes, okay, so Dan has said, good morning, Mr. Name. So good morning, Mr. Smith. Yep, that's fine. Good afternoon, Mr. Yep, that's fine. Yes, but not hi, not g'day. Unless you know the person, in which case you might be okay. All right, so I'm going to suggest we have a little break now. Okay, hold on a sec. I've got lots of kids. Okay. All right, so let's have a little break. It's now 11:06, so let's have 5 minutes, and then we'll quickly have a look at the pre-scene. You've seen this before. I've only got a couple of comments that might be important, and then I want to look at this Adrian Sims analysis of the pre-scene. So if we could come back at, let's say, 11:11, that would be good. Okay, so I'm going to pause the recording now. Okay, so welcome back. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to have a quick look at the pre-scene. As we've said earlier, the unseen is going to be the key thing, but you need to have a good familiarity with the pre-scene. You're able to read this just as well as I am, so I'm not going to again read it to you, but I'm going to point out some of the things again that I found worthwhile noting, and maybe okay, so yes, okay, so I'm just looking at chats. I'll fix up these chat things at the end, so we conclude things. So we're looking at a car company, lots of information here about it, and you can read all this yourself. I sort of think about it like in this case, like a Korean company like Hyundai or Kia. I've highlighted some things that I found interesting. They may or may not be the case. The growth and distribution of EL's divisions is something that their management is proud of, but anybody who's been involved in managing global operations realize that doing things at a distance is got a problem. And in particular, where you've got a leadership that has changed, where you've got somebody very much in control of a business. And you can imagine working, I used to work for example, Rupert Murdoch. He's a person that has this wide empire, but he has an ability to see what's going on and to understand what's going on, and he's able to exercise a good degree of control. But what we've seen here is that control of the old Mr. Tan has passed, and it's been passed on to a new, his son, a new leadership. And communication, again, in a big company is important, and getting the balance between control, which is what autocratic control is all about, and participation, which is what democratic is about, requires good leadership. And that's an issue that may arise. Again, I'm always wary of things that are put into exam papers as if, just as a throwaway. But in this case, growth develops highly developed IT systems. And in particular, if you're doing just in time or these sorts of design or development, which they're doing a lot of, the IT systems are very important. Most companies nowadays run on IT systems, and any breakdown in these IT systems can be very damaging. And particularly, the more complex the system that you have, the more important your IT system is. So to me, this is a possibility of an area that may be something that could get asked about. I'm not sure, I'm just saying it's a possibility. What you have to do for yourself is to go through this pre-scene and think about the things that could lead to issues. We'll see. There are some financial ones that we need to think about, but the strategy is called multi-domestic. It offers local product and enhancement and local strategy. When we look at Adrian Sims's pre-scene analysis, that appears to be an issue which we'll come back to in a little while. Another issue that may or may not happen, Tan family are 55% majority shareholders, several large institutional investors. In some Asian countries like Japan, this is very typical of what goes on. If this were a UK or American or Australian company, obviously the 45% shareholders would have a problem. But one of the things that we need to think about is, are these 45% of shareholders getting a fair crack of the whip, for example, with dividends and share prices? So that's an issue that may or may not arise. Okay. We'll come back to this thing of succession. You've had a strong autocratic leader, and control is very much possible when you've got somebody that people revere and respect and follow orders. But in this globally diverse structure that LCARs have got, and maybe just somebody who's a competent vice president of manufacturing, but again, possibly hasn't got the insight and maybe not ready for the top job. Is that a problem? It could well be. I've certainly seen this in real life. I used to do a lot of work for Caterpillar, and I went to an Asian country where this exactly happened. The father had run this dealership for Caterpillar for years and years, incredibly successfully, and when he died, his son took over, but the son wasn't the father, and this is a very similar thing. So he's been appointed CEO. Is that going to be an issue? It's possible. It's possible. So again, you need to consider that. Although I would think what we need to focus on perhaps are issues which have a financial implication. That may or may not have a financial implication. They may have an ethical one. One of the things that really is important that I've found is the attitude to suppliers. And obviously when we look at Adrian Sim's analysis, he'll come back to this. The attitude to suppliers is an ambiguous one. Sometimes they're are looking for the cheapest, lowest price, and other times developing cooperative relationships. But anybody who's been involved in things like just-in-time realize that you need a very good supplier relationship. So is that possible? Another thing here, again, where you see numbers, we need to check this. Demonstrated a determination to be among the big investors in R&D. According to this, they've got an annual investment of 5% of sales. Let me ask you a question. All of you have read this. How many of you have checked whether this 5% is realistic for the industry? Is it good or is it bad? Has anybody checked? Can you give me a tick or a cross? Tick or a cross if you checked and it is good. If you haven't done it, give me a cross. Okay, most of you haven't. All right, okay. So these are sort of things that you need to do. Sorry, I'm just going to mute you all. Oops. Yeah, these are sort of things you need to check before you get to the unseen. 5% of its sales in investment, and yet when you look at the financials, one of the things when I looked at the financials, it had a huge cash flow. Wonderful. But how much of it was being reinvested? If you look at the cash flow and look at the investments, how much of it was being reinvested? So again, that's a question mark. So I'm looking at question marks here. That might be something that might come up. Number of patent applications. Is this a good thing? It's got 6 R&D centers. Is this a good or a bad thing? Expensive. They've got 6 R&D centers because they're trying to do global things. They're trying to say, well, what do South American people want? What do people in Africa want? What do people in Europe want? Maybe, but is this an issue? 6 R&D centers. So again, I'm just highlighting questions that I would have if I was doing this exam. The one thing when I was working for Caterpillar trucks are very expensive and they run with high technology electronics, just like a car. I used to be able to lift the hood of a car and fix things, but I can't now. It's all computers. I need a specialist to do that. And so with electronic systems becoming more important as part of car technology, they've found it expedient to form a number of joint ventures with high-tech companies. Is this an area for a question? Possibly. I don't know. And if so, what's the implications of this? What are the implications of having a joint venture with a high-tech company? New product development. We've talked, I think in September, they had some problem with this, having their decisions overruled by headquarters and lots of frustration with regional managers. You have things here that is talking about moving from a sequential to a cross-functional approach. Again, what does that mean? Have you checked it? Have you looked into that? We might have a look at that next week when we look at some of these theories. Sought out and recruited some of Europe's top designers. Okay, so it's got unique designs. Maybe that's okay. One of the things down here, whenever they're introducing a thing, particularly for cost sharing, there's something here called platform sharing. And they explain, for example, that platform sharing has allowed it to produce more models from fewer platform types. Now, maybe you need to understand this because this, to me, sounds a perfect area to do something like product profitability. So I would want to know more about this so I understood. What does it mean, platform types? What does it mean? I've gone from 23 platform types to 7. It explains it a little bit here, but it doesn't really explain it enough to be able to model it. So I would want to know a little bit more about that if I were doing this exam. There's an ongoing problem with industrial relations. One of the reasons is the way AL manages its frontline staff. It's invested a lot in the engineering design of the assembly line, but it hasn't done a lot of things with its workforce. For example, Volvo was one of the first companies that allowed its workforce to develop skills so they could build a truck or a car by themselves as a team. Now, what this is saying is the Japanese car manufacturers have spent a lot of money training their frontline assembly workers, and obviously that's got a feedback with quality and Kaizen and all of those things. But AL has invested in the engineering design of the assembly line, but the line workers have fewer skills and less discretion. Is that an issue that's going to come up? Another issue, and again, you might want to think about ethics here. AL are represented by the company union. This is a bizarre thing. How can you have the company have a union that represents the workers when it's the company? Okay, that could be a problem. And again, I would highlight that. One of the things that all car companies have done, follow the leader. They've extended its warranties. It used to be you used to get 1 year warranty, then it was 2 years, 3 years. Now you get 5-year warranty plus things like free breakdown assistance and so on and so on. My question would be, have these things been included in their forecast, their costs? Because having an extended warranty is certainly going to be, if it's not paid for, if it's given free, it's certainly going to have a cost in the future. So again, I'd put a question mark there and want to check the forecast as to whether it's been included. Down here, competition, very worrying piece of information. Car industry suffers from excess production capacity. It's been estimated at 20 million units. 20 million units are made, which, or has the capacity to be made, greater than the market. So what is the impact of that? Well, the impact is that to sell your cars, you're going to have to do things with your pricing or your marketing or something. So that capacity is a problem. And how do they offset this? Car companies have been aware of this problem. They've done it by mergers and alliances. You see, for example, Tata Motors buying Land Rover, BMW buying Chrysler, and so on and so on. So we've got lots of these mergers. What they're trying to do is increase the scale of the operations, bring down unit costs, and sharing core competencies. They're not always successful. Some are. And what I would want to do before I did this exam is I'd want to consider which of these mergers have been successful or not successful, because if I could identify some of the things that make a successful merger, maybe one of the questions might be that one of the other car companies has come along and suggested a merger. And there's opportunities there to do some calculations, of course, but I'd want to know which ones were successful and why, because there's good examples. When they're talking about examples here, if you did a bit of research, you could certainly find some examples of successful or not successful mergers. We need to think about China and India. Obviously, they're gearing up for their own domestic demand. In due course, when that domestic demand is fairly satiated, they'll use this capacity to export to the rest of the world and much cheaper. So if you're making cars in Europe and you're paying somebody $100,000 a year to work on your assembly line, there's a big problem here. So we need to be aware of that. They're talking about excess inventory by using sales incentives, discounts, trade-ins, free upgrades, extended warranties. Again, have these things been taken into account in the forecasts that we're looking at? Question mark. Don't know. Some manufacturers build prestige cars, built to order. This is an interesting area. Most cars are built in an assembly line, just like they used to make computers 10 years ago, I guess. if you wanted a computer, you'd went to a company like Harvey Norman and picked something out of their inventory. Along comes Michael Dell and says, no, you don't need to do that. Get onto my website, pick what you want. I want this much RAM, this much memory, this much this, blah, blah, blah. And we'll make you one to order and we'll ship it to you. We'll cut out the middleman, cut out a lot of cost. And so they're building to order. Now they're doing this with prestige cars. And so because they don't have excess stock. If you want a Bentley or a Rolls Royce, they'll make it for you. You tell them what you want. So is this an opportunity or is this a threat? I don't know. You need to do that. They've managed to avoid the surplus capacity, but how long it can maintain this competitive edge depends on a wide range of factors, some of which may be beyond its control. So to me, that's an area where I think there's going to be a possible question. One of the things that they're talking about is quality. Obviously, quality in a high-end car is important, but the trend in cars, if you look at some of the websites for car manufacturing, I know as much about car manufacturing as you probably do, but small cars are in demand. Small cars, because of low-cost petrol and parking and going around in the city, small cars are in demand in both advanced and emerging economies. Now, when we look at Adrian's analysis, you'll see that if we did a product profitability based on the information that we've given, small cars are actually making a loss, and the bigger cars are making a bigger margin. So you've got an issue here. Should we stop making small cars and concentrate on big cars? Question mark. Don't know. That's sort of thinking that you've got to perhaps think about. Introduced a topic here called powertrains. Again, if you, like me, don't work in the car industry, I had to look up what a powertrain was and what it was all about. So powertrains are a basis for differentiation. So you need to understand what that is. And value for money as a differentiator. And obviously, there's an increasing number of dealers offering their cars for sale online. So again, like most products, you can shop around. And in fact, when we look at Adrian Sims's report, he gives you a website where you can go and look and see, I want to buy a Mazda 3. I want this color. I want these things on it. Where can I get it? And he'll just go through this website and say, here it is. Here's the price. And I can negotiate without even going there to see it, so on. It's just going to change the competitive environment. There's a trend to reduce service and maintenance costs by designing powertrains, so extend the length of time between the services required by the car. Again, why do people put that in if there's not something? Car producers need to pay particular attention to competitor information and analysis. That, to me, flags that you might get a question about competitor information or product profitability. Supply chain, threats and opportunities. There's something here for Swot. Parts make up 60% of the overall cost of a car, but as we'll see when we look at Adrian Sim's calculations, 60% is not the cost of selling a car. Toyota's, for example, marketing and advertising budget is almost as big as its manufacturing budget. So when we're looking at profitability of something, we can't just look at the parts or the manufacturing costs of something, particularly nowadays. So again, we've got to think about that. There's some talk here about suppliers, particularly car component suppliers. And again, I wasn't particularly aware of this, but there's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 type suppliers, and tier 1 are global mega suppliers. Okay, so they're supplying not just parts but sub-assemblies. They're actually doing some of the car assembly already. So maybe the dashboards, the axle, the suspension. So you buy the whole kit already made rather than the parts and assemble it yourself. They're talking about just in time. Obviously, that's an important thing. Obviously, where you've got just in time, the proximity of the supplier and the manufacturer need to be as close as possible. Because if you're just in time, trying to do just in time and buying things from China, then obviously there's a big time lag between when you order something and when you buy it. And in the past, L has shifted back between the two approaches: close relationships and driving people down on price. It's talking about relocation of production, and what it's saying clearly here, it's in the emerging economies that demand is seen to be the strongest. Okay. So the demand in Europe, in the USA, Japan, is declining, and it's in the emerging economies that demand is strongest. Talking about low-cost production and access to markets, that's why they've been relocating. But we've also got to consider that these are regional trading blocs like NAFTA, the EU, ASEAN, and Mercosur. So are these trading blocs going to have an impact on any of their operations? Possibly. We've got to talk about employees' feelings. Unable to report bad news. This is a common thing in some cultures. Somebody can't say this is wrong. It's just not permitted. And if you're unable to report bad news to their superiors because of fear it would jeopardize their jobs, it is a possibility of something that might appear in the unseen. So many problems, inappropriate forms of organizational structure, and so on. The union being run by the company may be a source of disagreement. We've already flagged that. And the car industry, the history of the car industry, if anybody is aware of it, has been dogged by industrial relation issues. And it's often the case, if you've ever worked in a factory, I've worked in quite a lot of factories where you've got an assembly line. These things just keep passing, and your job is to keep doing the repetitious thing, same thing, hour after hour. That in itself is a cause of frustration. Environmental challenges, financial crisis, yeah, I'm sure you can read that. Having a look at the org chart, the board of directors, and there's an advisory committee for the CEO, but there's no mention of what sort of people are on this advisory committee, so it's hard to discuss whether that's important or not. We've got some profit and loss, and again, you should do some analysis of that. Again, I'll just ask you, how many of you have done, let's say, a vertical or a horizontal analysis of these financials? If you have, give me a tick. If you haven't, give me a cross. Right, has? Yep. Okay, a couple have. Some of you haven't. Again, you need to do this. You need to have a think about, is there anything here that's obvious that we need to consider? So let's have a look at, for example, balance sheet. I had a quick look at this. We've got quite a high lot of payables here. If you look at, for example, the quick asset test, or the quick ratio, it's not too bad. It's not too bad. So I don't see anything worrying there. But here, this interested me. Purchase of non-current assets, which is possibly investment in something, was quite low considering the amount of cash they've got from their opportunities. And, you know, is that going to be sufficient for what they want to do? I don't know. I'm just looking for things that are of interest. Okay, so that's the pre-scene. There's a finance director's report. It's just pretty straightforward. There's nothing unexpected there. There's nothing unexpected there. It's just like a standardized report. You've got to really read it carefully. Further performance improvements and the ability to take advantage of demand improvements are dependent on continued investment in new plant and production techniques. So I suspect there might be something about investing in something, might be investing in a joint venture with one of these electronic companies. I don't know, but to me that's a possibility. Okay, how are we doing for time? If you haven't already seen this, I recommend you download this from the CIMA website. T4 tutor Adrian Sims is giving an analysis of the pre-scene. I'm not going to go through all of it again because, again, you can read it yourself. What he's talking about here is what he thinks being an examiner might have. And as we've said, a good place to start is a SWOT. And he actually gives you some information about some of the things that you might consider in a SWOT. So my advice to you is this week is, based on the pre-scene material, is why don't you just do a SWOT for yourself, given the comments that we've made, and see if you can identify those issues. And be prepared, of course, in the exam for those issues to change, but to practice it. Let's see what else I've highlighted. Again, what he's saying here, the 2014 forecast, which we saw, just hold on a sec. Sorry, there. This is the forecast profit and loss. Sorry, I didn't do this. I should have looked at it. Forecast profit or loss, again, you need to do some vertical and horizontal analysis. Is this forecast? My instinct when I look at it is this is just more of the same. This is like taking what's happened and just looking at as if nothing's going to change. I'm not sure I believe this. It looks too good to be true. But anyway, what Adrian is saying is this forecast that's on the last page of the pre-scene may change. In the unseen material, you may get something else. So you've got to be prepared to update your SWOT as soon as you get into the exam. You will be required to make at least 2 sets of calculations. So you've got to be thinking about, as soon as you're doing the reading of the unseen, what sort of calculations will I be asked to make? And we'll look at some possibilities in a moment. So he starts talking about Porter's 5 forces. I'm going to cover that next week, if that's all right with you. Generic strategies, I'll cover that next week. So we may not need to do that. This is an interesting chart, which again, the sort of things that you need to be considering. And what he's done is to separate these types of cars, compact or small cars, mid-range and executive cars, and looking at the percentage of gross profit that each of these takes. And obviously, just like you've done lots of times when you do product profitability, sometimes you get one that looks completely out of kilter. Okay, and on the face of it, you'd say to yourself, okay, we should stop making compact cars and move towards luxury sedans. So that's a tempting thought, but he goes on to talk about quite another way that we might think about this. Obviously, if you stop making these, there's a lot of fixed costs that are going to need to be absorbed, etc., etc. So what he's thinking, and I tend to agree with him, I think that's a possibility, is product profitability analysis might be one of those things that you might expect. And in the next week or the week after, we'll certainly have a look to refresh your memory about a product profitability analysis, particularly in the light of this calculation here. Okay, We need to understand that much better. So product profitability analysis could be one of those calculations that you're going to be expected to do. So if you can read this, that would be very useful. One of the things that you need to consider, and this is what we talk about thinking more widely, if you were just to do the financial analysis, you might think, okay, that's not worth making small cars. But when you think about how people are, maybe buying a small car is an avenue to buying a bigger car. Maybe when you start off, you can only afford a small car, but once you become loyal to a particular brand, when you get more money, you might move up. So is it important? And in particular, we need to consider the trend that we see in the manufacturing of car business, that small cars are increasing. So we've got to be careful that we don't make the wrong decision here, and we think a bit more widely. So this is what we mean by thinking more widely. Porter's Diamond, I'll cover that next week, so that's all right. We talked, when we looked at the pre-scene, about divisionalization, and Adrian talks about two different forms, and I think this is worth thinking about, how you might structure the organization, although it's a complex thing, and I'm not sure how much time you'd have to do this, but it's certainly, you need to be aware of it. It's a problem. Elle wants to do both, and what he talks about here, the geographic divisions may not be the right way to go. So you need to think about what those issues are with the structure of their organization. So inappropriate forms. So one of the other things that we might consider, we've talked about this before, the costs of having lots of research and development operations, and poor transfer of knowledge and learnings. Okay, knowledge transfer or knowledge management is an important thing these days. He compares the way that Elle have it with regional research and development and regional sales with luxury car makers like Mercedes and Benz and BMW. They have very similar marketing messages. They use a geocentric, which means they see the whole world as the market, and they use the same marketing material, but maybe in different languages, in different styles of advertising, but generally the same way, rather than trying to produce marketing materials for Latin America or for Africa. So again, that's more of a marketing thing than a financial thing. But his comment here is important. I wouldn't be surprised to see unseen material commenting on appropriate divisional performance measures to help contribute to the right balance between control and participation. Okay, so performance measures, always a key thing in strategic management accounting. Okay. There's talk there about the profit and loss account, and you should ensure you can construct the forecast profit and loss account for the volume and price assumptions on page 18. So let's go here to, okay, so here's the volume and price assumptions that are given. Can you construct, and I recommend that you try this yourself, can you construct a forecast based on this information and compare it with this forecast that you've been given? Can you find any holes in it? That's what he's saying here. In the exam, you may be requested to update this for different volumes, prices, and costs. So if you've already done it yourself, you've worked out how to calculate at least a gross profit, you can then update it when you come to the exam or the unseen. He talking here about something called a purchasing maturity model. And again, I'll cover this next week. And it is connected with this question of supply, and that may be a possibility. So here, again, whether it's correct or not, he's anticipating a question requiring candidates to discuss the implications of benefits of moving to the integrated stage. So I'll do this next week. These purchasing maturity model talks about different stages, and integrated is integrating corporate strategy with purchasing. So we'll have a look at that next week. So there's a lot to see here. I don't think there's anything there I was interested in. One of the things that he's interested in here is product development, which is a very important part of any car manufacturers, and he's talking about using technology to have, for example, design. Nowadays, just like me, I'm talking to you, I have no idea where you are. You could be across the street, you could be in another country. But we can design cars that way. We can do lots of things using technology. We don't have to have them all in one place. So sharing knowledge and networking is the foundation of future success. So that might be for the supply chain, or any customer-focused knowledge might be important. It might also be important for cost savings, which might be important. But the culture of that will have to change because we talked about having an authoritarian. He talks here about the advisors, whether they have the strategic insight. One of the problems you have, I guess, with an autocratic organization is the people that have grown up with the autocratic leader. Are they capable of giving the advice which is important to a leader, which sometimes says, no, you shouldn't do this? Whether these 8 advisors, have they got the freedom of thought to be able to think insightfully, or are they just used to following orders? Okay. So that's a possibility as well. One area that may help to introduce change and participation would be a change to the employee payments. As I said, having people on the assembly line just doing the same routine job, that can be done by robots these days, and in many cases is. Can you have something which encourages teamwork, which encourages a different way of working, but will be paid differently? There's another thing, if you look at the car manufacturing areas, that may be important, certainly important when we teach strategic management accounting, which is lean manufacturing and flexible manufacturing systems. It's possible you could have something about that. So again, I'm just flagging this. A requirement that asks you to advise management on a strategic investment decision would be a good way to assess your grasp. And I think this is the most likely one from my reading of it. I can't say any more than that. But you've got to describe, of course, in an investment decision, you've got to describe not only the financial part of it, net present value, discounted cash flow, blah, 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 but also the non-quantifiable benefits and considerations as well. So this is a possibility. And Adrian goes on to talk about what sort of investments might there be. For example, obviously new product development might be a thing, investment in new technologies, etc., might be investments in a joint venture. There might also be investment in staff training, investment in new technologies, in particular IT systems, and investment in collaboration with the supply chain. So of all the things that I think is likely, I think that's the most likely for me. So I'd be brushing up on discounted cash flows. I'd be brushing up on net present values. I'd be brushing up on the non-financial things that go around an investment that are important. If you're requested to do an appraisal, you should use the SAF framework, which I'm going to cover next week. and this will help you to assimilate these pre-seen and unseen parts. So I'll talk about this next week. It's quite clear from what I've been talking about, the pre-seen material is always very rich with potential issues. There's lots of issues that we've talked about. There's other ones that he needs to talk about. Obviously, in any business, you've got to talk about risk management. What are the risks that are facing, and how can I assess these risks? There are lots of them. Okay, so what sort of risk might I have? Competitor information is a key thing. How do we get competitor information? And I'm going to show you a place where you might find some of this. Ethics, we've talked about this. We've said there's no ethical dilemmas, no obvious ethical dilemmas in the unseen, and so they're going to be introduced. Adrian is suggesting unsafe cars. Well, we had that in September. Bribery, unfair business practice, obtaining illicit competitor information, fair treatment of staff and suppliers following a relocation. I think personally that's the most likely, but again, that's just my own personal opinion. He talks about the same thing we've talked about here, technical application, etc. So we've done that. We don't need to deal with that. Logic, we've done that. Down here at the end is some very important areas, I think. EL obviously is not a real-world business, but the business of manufacturing cars is real enough, and it won't do you any harm to do some research to understand the industry. Now, this OICA is actually, I've got it written down next, I was looking at it the other day. That's the International Organization for Motor Vehicle Manufacturers. The OICA is the French pronunciation of those words. And this is very interesting. There's a whole lot of information about competitors there. There's a whole lot of information about production of cars in different countries. So they show you different countries and tell you how many cars are produced, it is growing or declining, and so on. So I would recommend that you certainly have a look at that one. The Auto Alliance is just a website which is the creation of the 12 mostly prestige auto manufacturers, BMW, most of the other ones as well, I just can't remember them all. ACCA is the European Automobile Manufacturers Association. So if you want to understand, for example, a regional block, you can do that. And this one is very strange. At first, I thought, what's this got to do with anything? Because Edmunds.com is a website where you can just go and look to buy a car online. And so you can just go and pick your choice, and it will give you lots of places where you can buy these online without moving from your door. So what we're going to do is next week we're going to have a look at some exam solutions. So let me go back to my original thing here. Now, again, I'm open to this. I haven't received anything from any of you, so I don't know what you want me to do. But I'm suggesting next week, unless you tell me otherwise, and I'll unmute you all in a moment, that it might be an important thing to talk a little bit about each of these methodologies, at least to understand how they might be applied, because I feel one or more of them are going to be used. And so I'm suggesting next week that I might cover these things and explain and give some examples of them, and also to go through a model suggested answers. The September 2014 answers aren't available, but I can certainly go through a model answer from a previous exam and look at how, for example, you might take that framework that we looked at and enlarge it by putting in some answers. For those of you who need my email address, there it is, cliffbowles@gmail.com. If you've got anything you want me to particularly go through, you need to tell me a little bit, before Saturday, so at least I can prepare something. There's nothing worse as a tutor than being unprepared, and I don't like being unprepared. So if you want me to, for example, do something like customer profitability or product profitability or something like that, I'm happy to take your suggestions. And what I'm going to do now is unmute you all and ask if you've got any questions for me. Anybody got any questions for me?
Nothing from me, thanks, Cliff.
No? Everybody okay? If you're okay, can you give me a green tick? And yep, okay, thanks, Joe. Okay, Dan, thank you. Yep, Pierre, thank you. All right. If I don't hear from you, I will assume that you want me to cover these next week, which I will. And then the following week, what I'm thinking of doing is doing some proper calculations. You're going to have to do 2 serious calculations. And I'm thinking the following week we'll do something in Excel, for example, product profitability using the pre-seen material, or something like that. So if you've got any suggestions about those sort of calculations, I'm happy to do that. If you've got any questions, for example, about, I think somebody had a question here, clarify the mode of answering the exam or on paper. Well, it depends. I will, if you have a question about the CIMA exam, if you send it to me, I'll send it to CIMA and I'll get somebody there to respond to you. So that's all from me. I hope you found that useful. It's a lot of stuff to learn, so it's overwhelming at times, but this is what you've got to do. I'm going to switch off the recording and say good morning, and I'll see you next week. By the way, these recording will be available on the CIMA website, so if you want to watch it again, it'll be there on Monday, I guess. That's all from me.